A fortune built on ambition and coldness can crumble with a single phrase. When a businessman publicly scorns an innocent child, his reputation turns to dust before an outraged society. As enemies from the past emerge to accelerate his fall, he discovers that his greatest chance at redemption lies in the very girl he humiliated. But is a man so accustomed to power capable of giving up everything for something greater than himself? If this story interests you, subscribe to the channel to receive all our exciting stories. Continuing. The afternoon sun tinged the enormous windows of the Phoenix Building, headquarters of Richard Morgan's real estate empire, with gold. From the 40th floor he observed New York City like a king contemplating his kingdom. At 45, Richard had built an empire valued in billions, but his true pride was his reputation as an inflexible and determined man. "Mr. Morgan, the meeting with investors starts in 5 minutes, announced Sarah, his assistant for over a decade, unable to hide the nervousness in her voice. Richard adjusted his Italian tie and smiled at his reflection in the mirrored glass. "Any news about the approval of the New Horizon project?" "Yes, sir. The legal department has obtained all the necessary authorizations. The area will be vacated in 30 days. "Excellent." He turned, picking up his leather briefcase. "And what about tonight's charity event?" "Everything's organized, sir. The press has confirmed their presence, and your public relations team has prepared a speech emphasizing your commitment to social causes." Richard laughed, a sound without joy. "Perfect. We need this kind of exposure to soften the impact when we announce the project." The businessman crossed the corridor towards the meeting room, his steps echoing on the marble floor. Employees averted their gaze, some murmuring hasty greetings. Everyone knew that Richard Morgan did not tolerate interruptions or displays of weakness. In the meeting room, 10 of the country's most important investors were waiting. Richard began his presentation with the confidence of someone who had never known failure. "Ladies and gentlemen, the New Horizon project is not just another development. It's the redefinition of the concept of luxury in New York City. The projected images showed a complex of modern buildings with perfectly planned green areas. In 6 months, we will transform a degraded area into the most exclusive condominium in the city." "And what about the current occupants of the region?" questioned Helen Vasquez, an investor known for her keen eye for details. "I've heard rumors about social institutions in the area." Richard maintained his calculated smile. "All legal issues are resolved, Dr. Vasquez. The occupants will be properly relocated, and our social responsibility department has already prepared an action plan to minimize any negative impact." Helen made a note on her tablet, her face not revealing whether she was satisfied with the answer. After the meeting, Sarah handed Richard a folder with the details of the charity event. "You have 2 hours to prepare. The car will be waiting at 7 p.m. "Great. Prepare the press release about New Horizon. I want it released tomorrow, riding the positive wave of the event." As he descended to the garage in his private elevator, Richard reflected on his trajectory. Since he was young, he had learned that feelings were luxuries that businessmen couldn't afford. His father, before abandoning the family, had made that lesson clear. "In the business world, son, you're either the wolf or the sheep." The driver was already waiting with the Mercedes door open. Richard got in, checking the latest messages on his cell phone. Among them, an alert about protests against the New Horizon project, starting to organize on social media. "Nothing a good marketing campaign can't solve," he muttered to himself, putting the phone away. The car glided through New York traffic, taking him towards the event that, unbeknownst to him, would completely change the course of his life. In the back seat, Richard Morgan continued to be the same cold and calculating man as always, oblivious to the fact that in a few hours his empire would begin to crumble not by the strength of his enemies, but by something much more powerful: the innocence of a child. The ballroom of the Plaza Hotel sparkled under crystal chandeliers. Richard Morgan circulated among businessmen and politicians with the ease of someone who knew every rule of the social game. His presence at the charity event in support of New York's underprivileged institutions was strategically calculated. Every smile, every handshake, every vague promise of support was part of a larger plan. Richard, my friend, the voice of Charles Anderson, his main competitor in the real estate market, sounded falsely warm. What a pleasant surprise to see you supporting social causes. Morgan Developments has always valued social responsibility, Charles, Richard responded with equal falseness, bringing a glass of champagne to his lips. In fact, we'll soon be announcing a project that will revolutionize one of the city's most deprived areas. Among those present, Richard noticed Helen Vasquez talking privately with some investors. There was something in her gaze that bothered him, a veiled mistrust that would need to be carefully managed. Ladies and gentlemen, announced the Master of Ceremonies, we will now welcome some of the children benefited by our partner institutions who have prepared a special presentation. A group of about 20 children entered the ballroom, all dressed in simple but well cared for clothes. Among them, a girl of approximately 9 years old stood out, curly hair tied in 2 braids, carrying a basket with handmade flowers. These flowers were made by the children themselves, explained the project coordinator, and the proceeds from their sale will help maintain Hope House, which has been sheltering minors in vulnerable situations for 30 years. Richard observed with growing irritation as the children approached the guests offering their paper flowers. He checked his watch. He would still need to stay for at least another hour to keep up appearances. It was then that the girl with the braids approached him. Her large brown eyes shone with a hope that Richard hadn't seen in anyone for a long time. "Mister," she said, extending a delicately crafted blue flower, "I made this one myself. Would you like to buy it? It's to help our home." Richard stared at the flower with disdain. The ballroom had partially quieted, several gazes turned to the scene. Among them, he noticed a man with a professional camera, certainly some journalist covering the event. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice laden with a condescension that made some of those present shift uncomfortably. "Lily, sir," the girl smiled, still holding the flower. "I live at Hope House." It was at this moment that Richard made the mistake that would change his life. Perhaps it was the champagne, perhaps the stress of the New Horizon project, or simply his true nature emerging at the worst possible time. "Lily," he said, his voice raised enough to be heard by several of those present, "do you know how much a square foot costs in the area where your home is?" He paused dramatically, savoring his own sarcasm. "People are like objects, little one. Some have market value, others." He let the phrase hang in the air, making a dismissive gesture with his hand. The silence that followed was deafening. Lily lowered her eyes, her small hands clutching the paper flower. Some people gasped, others began to whisper. A camera flash went off. Helen Vasquez, who was observing the scene from nearby, took a step forward, but before she could intervene, the project coordinator was already beside Lily, protectively embracing her. "Come, dear," the woman said softly, casting an icy glare in Richard's direction. The businessman maintained his superior smile, apparently oblivious to the impact of his words. He turned to grab another glass of champagne, ignoring the looks of disapproval that now surrounded him. "That was completely unnecessary," Helen commented as she passed by him, her voice low but sharp. "And it may have consequences you can't yet imagine, Richard." He shrugged, still convinced of his untouchability. After all, what could a simple little girl with her paper flower do against the empire he had built? Little did he know that at that exact moment, the video of his cruel display of arrogance was already being shared on social media, starting a storm that none of his contacts or all his money could contain. The morning after the charity event, Richard Morgan arrived at the office at the same time as always, 7:30 a.m. The day would begin with the official announcement of the New Horizon project, and he was prepared to manage any small negative repercussion from the incident the night before. "Mr. Morgan," Sarah practically ran towards him as soon as he exited the elevator. Her normally controlled face showed unusual concern. "You need to see this immediately." In his office, Sarah projected the main social networks and news portals on the large screen. The color gradually drained from Richard's face as he absorbed the headlines. "Tycoon humiliates child at charity event. People are like objects." Businessman Richard Morgan compares orphans to disposable merchandise. Video shows true face, of real estate giant. The video, recorded by a freelance journalist present at the event, had gone viral overnight. It already had millions of views and shares. The comments were relentless. "I just cancelled my contract with Morgan Developments. I don't condone this kind of mentality," said one. "This man represents everything that's wrong with the real estate market," accused another. "Sarah, immediately convene a meeting with the crisis management team," Richard ordered, his voice tense, "and prepare an official statement. We'll clarify that my words were taken out of context." Before Sarah could respond, the phone began to ring. It was John Paul, the company's financial director. "Richard, we have a serious problem. Asia Construction just cancelled the partnership on the South Side project, and they're not the only ones. 3 other important investors are signaling that they're going to pull out." The businessman sat in his Italian leather chair, running a hand through his graying hair. "So it's just a momentary crisis, John. We've faced worse situations." But the following hours proved that this time was different. The video wouldn't stop spreading, gaining international repercussion. Journalists began to gather at the building's entrance. The company's stocks plummeted 15% right at the market opening. In the middle of the afternoon, Helen Vasquez requested an emergency meeting with the board of shareholders. Her expression, upon entering the meeting room, was that of someone who had already made an irrevocable decision. "Richard," she began, her voice calm but firm, "do you have any idea of the damage you've caused? It's not just a matter of image. It's about fundamental values." "Helen, don't be dramatic. In a week, no one will remember this anymore." "You're wrong." She slid a tablet across the table, showing new data. "We just lost the contract with the state government for the housing project. $40 million evaporated in less than 24 hours. Richard began to feel a sensation he hadn't experienced in a long time. Fear. But his pride still spoke louder. "They're all hypocrites," he retorted. "This girl, this orphanage, they're part of an area we need to revitalize. We're bringing progress." "Progress?" Helen stood up, placing her hands on the table. "Do you know which orphanage that is, Richard? Hope House. The same one you plan to demolish to build your New Horizon project." The silence that followed was heavy. Other board members exchanged worried glances. "As board president," Helen continued, "I suggest we temporarily suspend the New Horizon project and initiate an internal investigation into all expropriation procedures." "You can't do that," Richard slammed the table. "The project is my priority." "Actually, we can, and I've already called for an extraordinary vote tomorrow." Helen gathered her belongings. "I suggest you use this time to reflect on your priorities, Richard, because ours as a board are very clear." When everyone left the room, Richard remained seated, watching the sun set through the windows of his empire. For the first time in decades, the glass and steel walls seemed suffocating. His cell phone wouldn't stop receiving notifications. More cancellations, more criticism, more losses. On his desk, the screen still showed Lily's face, the orphanage girl, frozen at the exact moment her eyes lost their sparkle in the face of his cruel words. And somewhere in his conscience, a voice he had long tried to silence began to question whether the real disposable object wasn't himself, with all his empty wealth and power built on indifference. The morning of the board's extraordinary vote dawned with an even more unpleasant surprise for Richard Morgan. On the front page of the country's main newspapers, an investigative report signed by Michael Torres, a renowned economic journalist, revealed worrying details about the acquisition process of the New Horizon project's lands. The approvals were too quick, commented Sarah, handing Richard his untouched breakfast. The journalist suggests there were irregularities in the environmental and social assessment processes. Richard nervously flipped through the newspaper in his office. The article was extensive and devastating, revealing that Hope House wasn't the only social institution affected by the project. A school for children with special needs and a senior support center would also be impacted. "I want to know who leaked this information," he demanded, his voice trembling with anger. "Someone from the inside is sabotaging me." The phone rang. It was Helen Vasquez again. "I imagine you've already seen the newspapers," she said without preamble. "The vote has been moved up to 10 a.m. and Richard, come prepared." as he prepared. For the meeting, Richard received an unexpected visit. Charles Anderson, his old rival, entered his office with a smile that mixed satisfaction and false concern. "I came to offer you an honorable way out, Richard," he announced, sitting down. "Uninvited. Sell me your part of the New Horizon project. 15% below market value. It's a generous offer considering the circumstances." "So that's it?" Richard laughed bitterly. "You're behind this campaign against me?" "Please," Charles made a dismissive gesture. "You caused this all by yourself. I'm just taking advantage of the opportunity. I even have some ideas to reformulate the project, make it more socially responsible." "Get out of my office," Richard growled. "As you wish, but think carefully. My offer is only valid until the end of the day." Charles calmly stood up. After the vote, the value might drop considerably. At 10 a.m. sharp, the boardroom was packed. Helen presided over the meeting with a grave expression. Richard noticed that several board members avoided his gaze. "Before we begin the vote," Helen announced, "I'd like to share some additional information." She signaled, and her assistant distributed folders to those present. "In the last few days, our legal team has done a complete survey of the acquisition and approval processes for the New Horizon project." Richard felt his stomach sink as he opened the folder. They were copies of emails, contracts, and internal documents that he believed were well guarded. "As you can see," Helen continued, "there are serious ethical and procedural issues that need to be investigated. Additionally, we've just received a notification from the Attorney General's office requesting clarification on possible irregularities in the social impact assessments." The room filled with murmurs. Richard looked around, seeking some ally, but found only closed or averted faces. "I propose not only the suspension of the project," Helen proceeded, "but also a temporary removal of Mr. Morgan from the executive presidency until the conclusion of the investigations." "This is a coup." Richard stood up, slamming the table. "You can't do this. I built this company." "Richard," Helen's voice was almost gentle, "you built an empire, it's true, but you seem to have forgotten that empires need solid foundations, not just of concrete and steel, but of values and principles." The vote was quick and devastating. Unanimously, the board approved both the suspension of the project and Richard's removal. As he left the room, still stunned, Richard found Sarah waiting with more news. Human rights advocacy groups were organizing a large protest in front of the company headquarters. Social media was now speculating about other past projects of the construction company, looking for similar cases of controversial expropriations. In his office, Richard looked out the window at the city he had always considered his private kingdom. Now each building seemed to remind him of some questionable decision, some moment when he chose profit above any human consideration. His phone vibrated with a message from Charles Anderson. "Offer still stands, but the discount is now 30%. In the midst of all that storm, something unusual caught his attention. Among the hundreds of critical messages and threats on his social media, there was a photo. Lily, the orphanage girl, was still making her paper flowers. The caption, written by the Hope House coordinator, said, "Even after everything, she still believes she can make the world a better place, one flower at a time." For the first time in decades, Richard Morgan felt something different from pride or ambition. He felt shame. A week after his removal, Richard Morgan observed the city from the terrace of his penthouse on Fifth Avenue. The empire he had built now seemed as distant as the lights twinkling on the horizon. His routine of meetings and important decisions had been replaced by endless consultations with lawyers and press advisors. "The opinion polls are disastrous," informed Paul Rivers, his new crisis management consultant, spreading graphs across the dining table. "We need a dramatic action to reverse this situation, something that shows your human side." Richard sipped his whiskey, a rare bottle that now tasted like bile. "And what do you suggest, that I make a public apology? That I kneel before the cameras?" "Better than that," Paul smiled, picking up a folder. "We discovered that the girl, Lily, has a particularly moving story. Orphaned since she was 3, natural artistic talent, exemplary grades in school. We can use this." "Use?" Richard frowned. "Yes, just imagine you announce a scholarship program in your name with Lily as the first beneficiary. We do an event, take some strategic photos, show that you've repented and are willing to change." The businessman walked to the balcony, feeling the cold night wind. Something about that proposal bothered him in a way he couldn't explain. "What?" "About the orphanage?" he asked, his voice lower than normal. "Well, technically we can still proceed with the expropriation. The project is suspended, not cancelled, but we can use the scholarship as public compensation. It's even cheaper than relocating the entire orphanage." Richard closed his eyes, remembering the sparkle in Lily's eyes when she offered him the flower. It was the same sparkle he saw in his younger sister's eyes so many years ago before life separated them. "No," he said finally. "What do you mean, no?" Paul seemed confused. "We're not going to use the girl or her story." Richard turned to the consultant. "If we're going to do something, it has to be genuine." "Richard, be reasonable. Your reputation is in tatters. The company's stocks have plummeted. Investors are fleeing. We need to act fast. Get out," Richard ordered, his voice calm but firm, "and cancel the contract with your agency." Alone again, Richard picked up his laptop. For the first time in days, he ignored the news about his fall and the endless critical messages. Instead, he searched for information about Hope House. What he found surprised him. The institution had a history of more than 3 decades, having helped hundreds of children. Many of its former residents were now successful professionals who regularly returned to help. The place survived mainly on donations and the work of volunteers. On a blog maintained by the coordinator, he found more photos of Lily. In one of 8, the girl was teaching other children how to make paper flowers. The caption read, "Lily believes that each flower she makes carries a little piece of hope for whoever receives it." Without thinking too much, Richard got in his car and drove to the location. It was already past 9 at night when he parked in front of the old mansion that housed the orphanage. The lights were still on, and through the windows he could see some children finishing their homework. He stayed there, watching, for almost an hour. He thought about his own childhood, the choices he made, the walls he built around his heart. He remembered when he believed that success meant only numbers in a bank account. His phone rang. It was Helen Vasquez. "Richard, we need to talk," she said, her tone surprisingly less hostile. "I received an interesting proposal from Charles Anderson about New Horizon. He wants to buy your part and reformulate the project." "Helen," he interrupted, "do you remember my sister?" The silence on the other end of the line was long. Helen was one of the few people who knew this part of his past. "Of course I remember, Richard. Why?" "She was the same age as Lily when she went to a place like this." His voice faltered slightly. "And I never looked for her again. I was too busy building my empire." "Richard," Helen hesitated. "What are you planning?" He observed the mansion once more, where now the lights were beginning to go out. A decision was starting to form in his mind, something that the old Richard Morgan would consider madness. "I don't know yet," he answered honestly. "But for the first time, in a long time, Helen, I want to do something that doesn't just involve money or power." As he hung up the phone, Richard realized his hands were shaking. Years of certainties and arrogance were beginning to crumble, like a poorly constructed building. And amidst the rubble of his former self, a small paper flower was starting to bloom. The morning after his visit to the orphanage, Richard woke up with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. Still in his pajamas, he sat down in his home office and began to review all the documents of the New Horizon project, this time with a different perspective. Sarah, who remained loyal even after his removal, arrived early with the latest updates. "Charles, Anderson is calling a press conference for this afternoon," she informed, worried. "It looks like he's going to announce the purchase of the project." "He hasn't bought anything yet," Richard replied, not taking his eyes off the papers. "Sarah, I need you to find someone for me. It's important." "Who?" "My sister, Beth Morgan. The last information I have is that she was adopted by a family from upstate New York about 30 years ago." Sarah's eyes widened. surprised by the unexpected request. In all her years working with Richard, it was the first time he had mentioned his sister. "I'll start the search immediately," she promised, making notes. "Anything else?" "Yes. Schedule a meeting with the Hope House coordinator, and don't disclose this to anyone, especially not to the press office." As Sarah left, Richard received a message from Helen. "I need to show you something. Can I stop by in an hour?" Helen arrived punctually, carrying a thick folder. Her normally severe face showed an expression that was difficult to read. "Before you show me anything," Richard interrupted her, "I need to tell you my decision." He led Helen to his living room, where he had spread plans and documents all over the coffee table. "I want to completely reformulate the New Horizon project," he announced. "Not a cosmetic change, but a real transformation. Preserve the orphanage, the special school, and the senior center. Integrate these institutions into the project, create common living areas, training programs." "Richard," Helen tried to interrupt, "I know it sounds crazy, but I've done the math. We can reduce the number of luxury units, create part of the development with more affordable prices. The return will be lower, but it's still viable." "Richard," Helen raised her voice, "you need to see this first." She opened the folder, revealing a series of old documents. Richard recognized some of them. They were records from the beginning of his career, from when he still worked at his mentor's development company, Vincent Ashford. "Where did you get this?" "A young lawyer brought it to the company yesterday. He says he has more evidence." Helen hesitated. "These are documents about how you got your first big project, the one that launched you in the market." Richard sat down slowly, feeling the weight of memories. "The Industrial Village project." "Yes." "The lawyer. He's Albert Thompson's son." The name hit Richard like a punch. Albert Thompson had been his main competitor in that project 20 years ago. Richard used privileged information to win the bid, leading Albert's company to bankruptcy. "He wants to reveal everything to the press," Helen continued. "Not just this, but apparently he has evidence of other similar situations over the years." Richard closed his eyes, remembering the man he used to be, ruthless, willing to do anything for success. How many lives had he affected along the way? "What's his name?" he finally asked. "Peter Thompson, and he doesn't want money, Richard. He wants justice." At that moment, Sarah returned to the room with more news. "I managed to locate your sister," she announced, not realizing she was interrupting something important. "Beth lives in Albany. She's a social worker. She works with children in vulnerable situations." The irony of the situation didn't escape Richard. While he built his empire on foundations of greed and manipulation, his sister dedicated her life to helping others. "There's one more thing," Sarah continued, hesitant. "I got the meeting with the Hope House coordinator. She agreed to see you, but with one condition. She wants you to spend an entire day at the orphanage, really getting to know their work." Richard looked at the documents Helen had brought, then at his own plans to reformulate the project. The past and the future seemed to be on a collision course. "I accept the condition," he said finally. "And as for the lawyer, schedule a meeting with him too. It's time to face the consequences of my choices." Helen observed him with a mixture of surprise and respect. "You know this could cost everything you've built, don't you?" Richard picked up one of the paper flowers he had kept from the charity event, turning it between his fingers. "Maybe," he answered. "That's exactly what I need." For the first time in decades, Richard Morgan parked his luxury car on a simple neighborhood street at 7 in the morning. Hope House, seen in daylight, revealed itself to be an old but well-maintained building, with colorful drawings decorating the windows and a small garden at the entrance. Mrs. Connie, the orphanage coordinator, was waiting for him at the gate. Her gaze was a mixture of caution and expectation. "Good morning, Mr. Morgan," she said, formal. "I hope you're prepared. Here we follow the children's routine." Richard nodded, feeling strangely out of place in his Italian suit. As he entered the mansion, he was greeted by the buzz of children preparing for breakfast. "Uncle Richard," Lily's voice sounded cheerful, surprising everyone. She ran towards him, carrying more paper flowers. "I made even prettier ones, want to see?" The businessman felt everyone's eyes on him, staff, children, and especially Mrs. Connie. This time something was different inside him. "Of course I do," he replied, kneeling down to be at the girl's height. "How do you make each one different from the other?" Lily's smile lit up her whole face. "It's because each one has a piece of the heart of who makes it. Come, I'll teach you." The next few hours were a revelation for Richard. He helped serve breakfast, discovering that some children needed special attention with their meals. He learned that each one had their unique story, their particular dreams and fears. During the craft workshop, he sat with Lily and other children, his unaccustomed hands struggling with the colored paper. "It's all crooked," he complained, frustrated with his third attempt to make a flower. "That's okay," Lily consoled. "The important thing is the love you put into it. Look, this slightly crumpled side even looks like a real petal." At lunchtime, Richard discovered that the orphanage depended on donations and the tireless work of volunteers to keep meals nutritious and varied. The cook, Mrs. Zoe, worked miracles with limited resources. "How do you manage to keep everything running?" he asked Mrs. Connie during a break. "With a lot of love and creativity," she replied, serving him coffee. "Every penny is planned, every donation is precious. But you know what worries us most? It's not just the money, it's the uncertainty. These children have already lost so much. In life, Mr. Morgan, the orphanage is the only stability they know." In the afternoon, while helping some children with their homework, Richard received an urgent call from Sarah. "Charles Anderson gave the press conference," she informed. "He announced that he's in advanced negotiations to buy your part of the project. The press is speculating that you're being forced to sell due to investor pressure." Richard looked at Lily, who at that moment was helping a younger boy with his math. "Sarah, prepare all the documents for the New Horizon project and schedule a meeting with our team of architects for early tomorrow morning." "But what about Charles's proposal?" "I'm not selling," his voice was firm. "I'm going to do something very different." As the sun began to set, Richard participated in the last activity of the day, the story circle. Each child could tell a piece of a collective story, and he was surprised by the creativity and hope that emanated from each narrative. "Now it's your turn, Uncle Richard," Lily insisted. He hesitated, then began. "Once upon a time, there was a man who built walls so high that he forgot what it was like to see the sky. At the end of the day, as he was preparing to leave, Lily called him one last time. 'Uncle Richard, this one's for you.' She handed him a blue paper flower, different from all the others. 'I made it thinking of the sky, so you never forget to look up again.' On the way home, Richard made a stop. He parked in front of the land where New Horizon would be built. The sun was setting behind the old buildings, painting the sky in shades he hadn't stopped to admire in a long time. His phone rang. It was Peter Thompson, Albert's lawyer son. "Mr. Morgan," the young man's voice was tense. "Did you receive my message about the meeting?" "Yes," Richard replied, looking at the paper flower on the car's dashboard. "And before you present your findings, there are some things I need to tell you. About your father, about who I was, and about who I want to become." The law office where Peter Thompson worked occupied a modest floor in a commercial building downtown. Richard, who arrived punctually at 9 in the morning, noticed that the place was very different from the luxurious environments he used to frequent. "Mr. Morgan," Peter greeted him formally. He was a young man, couldn't be more than 30, but his eyes carried a weight that Richard knew well, the weight of unfulfilled promises and interrupted dreams. "Before you begin," Richard said, sitting down, "I'd like to show you something." He opened his briefcase and spread plans and projects on the table. "This is the new project I'm developing." Peter examined the documents with skepticism. "What does this have to do with what I discovered about your past?" "Everything." Richard took a deep breath. "Because to make this project happen, I first need to correct my mistakes, starting with what I did to your father." Over the next 2 hours, Richard detailed not only his past actions, but also how each unethical decision had shaped his empire. He spoke about the manipulated competition that destroyed Albert Thompson's company, about insider information and fraudulent contracts. Why are you telling me all this? Peter asked, his voice trembling slightly. Because you deserve to know the whole truth, and because I want your help to do something different. Richard explained his vision for the New Horizon, a project that would integrate the orphanage, the special school, and the senior center into a planned complex with common areas and social programs. And what about the money my father lost, the lives you affected? I have a proposal. Richard took another document from his briefcase. I want to create a foundation, not just to manage the social projects of the new development, but to identify and compensate people who were harmed by my actions over the years. I'd like you to manage this foundation. Peter stood up, walking to the window. Why should I trust you? I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to help me do the right thing, even if it's for the wrong reasons. At that moment, Peter's secretary interrupted with urgent news. Charles Anderson had called another press conference. He was announcing that he had the support of the main investors to take control of the project. See? Peter pointed to the television. He's going to do exactly what you used to do. The cycle continues. Not if we can prevent it. Richard smiled for the first time. In fact, I've already started acting. Helen Vasquez is presenting our new proposal to the board right now. On the other side of town, Helen was entering the meeting room with her own folder of documents. The board was complete, including Charles Anderson, who seemed surprised by the sudden summons. Gentlemen, Helen began, before we make any decision about the future of the New Horizon project, I'd like to present an alternative. Meanwhile, in Peter's office, Richard was receiving live messages from Sarah about the meeting. You still haven't answered my question, Peter insisted. Why this change now? Richard took the paper flower that Lily had given him out of his pocket. I met a little girl who taught me that each person carries a piece of sky inside them. I spent so much time building walls that I forgot to look up. Now I want to build bridges. Bridges are harder to build than walls, Peter observed. Yes, they are. That's why I need help from people who understand both pain and hope. Richard's phone rang. It was Helen. The board approved, she announced, her voice laden with emotion. With some conditions, but they approved. Charles is furious, but he can't do anything. The majority voted in favor of the new project. Richard looked at Peter, who was still contemplating the city through the window. So, will you help me build something different? The young lawyer turned slowly. In his hands, he held an old photo, him as a child, next to his father, in front of the family's old construction company. On one condition, Peter finally said, I want the foundation's first action to be creating a scholarship program in my father's name, for children from Hope House. Richard extended his hand. Deal. When he left the office, Richard received another piece of news from Sarah. His sister, Beth, had agreed to meet him. The meeting would be the next day at Hope House itself. In the elevator, Richard looked again at the paper flower. He realized he was beginning to understand what Lily meant about each one carrying a piece of the maker's heart. Some transformations, like flowers, need time and care to bloom. Hope House was especially quiet on that Sunday morning. Mrs. Connie had organized a trip with the children to the park, leaving only Lily, who insisted on staying to support Uncle Richard in the meeting with his sister. Richard arrived an hour before the agreed time, his hands cold with sweat, as he helped Lily arrange paper flowers on the visiting room table. 30 years had passed since he last saw Beth. She was only 9 years old, the same age Lily was now. Are you nervous, Uncle? Lily asked, adjusting a blue flower in the center of the arrangement. Very, he admitted, smiling nervously. You? No, Lily, sometimes we make mistakes so big that we don't know if there's a way to fix them. But of course there is, the girl exclaimed with the simplicity of childlike wisdom. You just have to really want to and do things differently. You taught me that yourself. Richard laughed. I taught you that? Yes, when you were trying to make your first paper flower and didn't want to give up until you got it right. The sound of a car parking made Richard freeze. Through the window, he saw a woman in her 40s, brown hair tied in a simple bun, getting out of a silver Toyota. Even after so long, he immediately recognized Beth's eyes. They were the same as their mother's. Lily quickly squeezed his hand before running to the kitchen, leaving him alone to receive his sister. Beth entered, hesitantly, carrying an old folder. Her eyes met her brother's, and for a moment, no one said anything. "Hi, Beth," Richard finally managed to say, using her childhood nickname. Beth took a deep breath. "Richard," she looked around, noticing the paper flowers. "They're beautiful. Very special friend taught me how to make them." He gestured to the armchairs. "Would you like to sit down?" The first few minutes were filled with a heavy silence, broken only by the clinking of coffee cups that Lily brought before discreetly withdrawing again. "You looked for her, didn't you?" Beth finally spoke. "Our mother." Richard nodded. 15. Years ago, she had already passed away. "I know." Beth opened the folder she had brought, revealing old photos. "My adoptive family helped me find her when I turned 18. We spent 5 years together before she fell ill." Richard felt the weight of each lost year. "I'm sorry, Beth, I should have been there. I should have looked for you sooner." "Why didn't you look?" The question came out softly, but laden with decades of pain. "Because I was ashamed." Richard stood up, walking to the window. "When Dad abandoned us, I promised myself I would never be vulnerable like him, that I would build something so big that no one could hurt me. In the process, I became someone worse than him." "I saw your interviews over the years," Beth commented. "The powerful Richard Morgan, always so sure, so untouchable." "A house of cards," he laughed bitterly. "It took just a little girl with a paper flower to start bringing it all down." At this moment, as if on cue, Lily returned to the room carrying a photo album of the orphanage. "Sorry to interrupt," she said shyly, "but I thought Aunt Beth would like to see photos of our activities." Beth smiled for the first time, a smile that reminded Richard so much of their mother that he felt his eyes water. "You work with children too, don't you?" Lily asked Beth, sitting between the two siblings. "Yes, for 20 years. Beth flipped through the album with interest. "I help children find new families, like what happened to me." "And are you happy?" Richard asked softly. Beth looked at her brother, her eyes softening. "I am, Richard. I learned that family isn't just blood, it's choice, it's care, it's being present." Lily suddenly jumped off the sofa. "I'll be right back. I need to get something." When they were alone again, Beth took out another photo from the folder. It was her and Richard as children before everything fell apart. "Mum kept this photo until the end," she said. "She never lost hope that one day we would be a family again." Richard held the photo with trembling hands. "Can we try now? I know it's late, but—" "It's never too late to rebuild," Beth completed, just as Lily returned with more paper flowers. "I made these especially for today," the girl announced proudly. "Blue for Uncle Richard because he's learning to look at the sky again, and pink for Aunt Beth because she helps build new love every day." The siblings looked at each other, and something from the past began to heal. "Lily," Beth began, "did you know that when I was your age, I also loved doing crafts?" As the two chatted, Richard received a message from Helen. The revised New Horizon project was ready to be presented to the community. Looking at his sister and Lily, Richard realized that he was finally building something truly valuable. "Beth," he called softly, "would you like to know about a project I'm developing? I think your experience would be very valuable." Beth smiled, reaching out to hold her brother's hand. "I'd love to, Ricky." The use of the old childhood nickname made Richard's eyes water again. "I'd love to very much." The auditorium of the Cultural Center was packed for the presentation of the New Horizon project. 6 months had passed since the charity event. That changed everything. And Richard Morgan was about to officially reveal the transformation, not just of a real estate development, but of a world view. Backstage, Helen was adjusting the final details of the presentation, while Richard observed the audience forming. Among those present were his former rivals, including Charles Anderson, who was still trying to understand how he had lost control of the situation. Journalists settled into the front rows, their cameras ready to record the event. "Everything's ready," Peter Thompson approached, now no longer an adversary but the legal director of the newly created New Paths Foundation. The first scholarships will be announced today. Richard adjusted his tie, no longer Italian, but a simple piece, chosen by Lily for the occasion. In the front row, his sister Beth smiled encouragingly, seated next to Mrs. Connie and the children from Hope House. "Ladies and gentlemen," Helen began the presentation, "it is with great satisfaction that we present today not just a new real estate project, but a new way of thinking about urban development." The lights dimmed and Richard took his place on the stage. On the screen behind him, images of the project began to be displayed. "6 months ago," he began, his voice firm but humble, "I was right here, in this cultural center, being a very different person. Someone who measured success in square feet and bank figures, someone who built walls so high that he forgot to look at the sky." On the screen, the project revealed itself, a harmonious complex where modern and traditional met. Hope House would not only be preserved, but integrated into a larger community center. The special school would gain new facilities, and the senior center would be expanded. "New Horizon will not be just another luxury development," Richard continued. "It will be an example of how we can grow without excluding, develop without, destroying progress without forgetting our humanity." Peter Thompson took the microphone to detail the social programs that would be implemented through the foundation. Scholarships, professional training programs, cultural initiatives, all integrated into the residential complex. "And to ensure that this commitment is permanent," Richard resumed, 50% of the project's profits will be allocated to the maintenance and expansion of these programs. A murmur ran through the auditorium. Charles Anderson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Some will say this is business madness," Richard smiled, "that I'm destroying shareholder value. But I've learned that there's a different kind of value, one that can't be measured in financial reports." Lily, seated next to Beth, stood up and walked to the stage, carrying something in her hands. Richard knelt down to be at her height. "I brought something special for today," she said, handing him a new paper flower. "This one made with pages from the old project, transformed into something new and beautiful." "Look," Richard showed the flower to the audience, his voice choked. "Sometimes we need to deconstruct who we are to build something better." This flower was made with pages from the original project, the one that intended to demolish dreams in the name of progress. Now it represents something new, just as we can all transform when we open our hearts to new possibilities. Helen presented the final numbers of the project, smaller in luxury scale, but much larger in social impact. To the surprise of many, the financial projections showed that, although with smaller margins, the development remained viable and sustainable. "And to ensure that this transformation is permanent," Richard announced, "I am stepping down from the executive presidency of the company. Helen Vasquez will assume the position, while I will dedicate myself fully to the New Paths Foundation, alongside Peter Thompson and," he smiled at his sister, "with the special consultancy of Beth Morgan in our social programs." The presentation ended with a video showing testimonials from residents of the area, including the children from the orphanage, talking about their hopes for the future of the neighborhood. When the lights came on, the first person to stand up and applaud was Charles Anderson. "You won, Richard," he said later during the reception, "but not in the way you used to win." "No, Charles," Richard replied, watching Lily teach other children how to make paper flowers in a corner of the hall. "For the first time, it's not about winning or losing. It's about building something that goes beyond ourselves." Later, when the event ended, Richard found himself again on the terrace of his penthouse, but this time he wasn't alone. Beth was by his side, as well as Lily and several other children from the orphanage, all watching the sunset paint the new High York City sky. "You know, Uncle Richard," Lily said, holding his hand, "I think now you know how to make flowers prettier than mine." Richard laughed, hugging the girl. "No, Lily, you taught me something much more important. How to make my heart bloom again." Beth joined the hug, and Richard felt finally that he was building something truly unshakable. Not an empire of concrete and steel, but a legacy of love and transformation. On the horizon, the sun was setting over a city that, little by little, was learning that progress and humanity could walk hand in hand. And somewhere, a small blue paper flower continued to remind that it's never too late to look at the sky and start over.